Hi team, and welcome to this week's lecture about differentiation. Now, differentiation is really important in all aspects of your teaching, but in particular with literacy. It's really important because we need to be able to make sure that we are catering to all academic abilities within the grade. So we make sure that we are extending the high kids, the kids who are above the expected grade level. We make sure that we are continuing to extend them. So even though we have kids come to us who are above the expected area, as we know from Hattie's research, that all kids deserve to have that element of growth. So for 6 months instruction or 12 months instruction, we should still see the same amount of growth from those who are academically above the achievement standards. Same being said for those who are struggling. We need to be able to cater to people in our classroom who need that extra help. What are we going to do to be able to ensure that those kids are successful with their learning? And of course, we can't forget those kids in the middle. How are we going to make sure that they continue to progress with their learning as well? It can be a bit complex. And I must say that it's probably easier to differentiate within mathematics because we can see with maths that there are particular skills. So there are particular number skills that you have to have. There are particular skills. Say you were doing multiplication, we would know that we would start off, say, with an array. We'd start off with drawing the multiplication before we could even think about doing, say, like a multiplication algorithm. So with the mathematics, the skills are quite clear and quite straightforward. With literacy, it can be a little bit trickier. So today we're going to talk about what differentiation is, and then I'm going to walk you through a little lesson planner that I've made so that you can see how you're going to differentiate within your own lesson that you're doing for Assessment 1. So these were taken from the Department of Education Literacy Toolkit. So you can access this yourself if you go into the Literacy Toolkit and Google or use the search function to find differentiation. And one thing that you can do is adjust the product. So that is meaning that you are adjusting the success criteria for particular students. One thing that I can't stress enough with really good differentiation is that you're not changing the focus or the purpose of the learning intentions for particular students. So if the focus of the lesson is to learn to visualize, everyone in the class is going to be working on that particular learning intention. The only thing that will be different is the success criteria for some students. Some students might need a scaffold or a prompt to help them. Some students might need a different text. So we're able to change the product or change what we ask of the students in order to differentiate the task. But because there might be a group of students in the class who can't, say, identify their CVC words, then we don't then go and give them a whole different task and say, you're not able to do that. So we want everyone to be working on the same task so that everyone feels included and everyone can participate in the reflection in the same way. We don't want to isolate anyone or feel like that they can't do what everybody else is doing. So we make sure we keep the focus the same. We just differentiate the tasks or the level of difficulty of the tasks that we're asking the students to do. So teachers can differentiate the product of a lesson by asking some students to teach each other. Students had to complete the object of the lesson or to use specific learning outcomes to complete the task. So things that you could consider are student grouping. So you could have mixed abilities, you could have ability lessons, you could have some sort of modelling or peer teaching going on. As well as academic differentiation, we also have the ability to adjust the process, which is the second point here. So when you adjust the process of the lesson, you are changing the methods you use to teach and how you expect the kids to learn. So an adjustment could look like asking for some collaborative learning. So if you know that a particular group maybe are going to struggle with a concept, you use the idea of collaboration to help. But it's also things like time, giving kids more time, adjusting the process in terms of what steps you ask them to do. Do they need a template? What kind of scaffolding are you going to give them to be able to make sure they're successful in the lesson? Here is an example that I've come up with for you guys. So my focus for this lesson is summarising, and summarising is a comprehension strategy. So I've gone into the Australian curriculum, sorry, not Australian curriculum, the Victorian curriculum, and I've found the content descriptors or the curriculum standard for that one, which is use comprehension strategies to build literal or inferred meaning and begin to analyse text, drawing on growing content knowledge, language, visual features, print, and multimodal structures. That's quite a large content descriptor, and we teach comprehension in a lot of different ways. So one of the ways we teach it is through being able to summarise a text. I'm going to ask my students to recall the main events of a narrative, and my success criteria involves can I identify the most important parts of the text? I can summarize the events in order. So we want a sequence. We're looking for a sequence, and we can talk to the kids about what that word means. Perhaps you can use things like time connectives, like first, next, after, finally, or beginning, middle, end, or give them some sort of time structure to show that sequence. And I can use the SWBST. I've actually forgotten what that acronym stands for, but it's like so, what, then. There's an actual little acronym that goes along with that one. So when you've got modelled instruction or a modelled introduction, you want to have a really good mentor text and ask the kids to watch what you're doing so that you're able to give them a worked example. Now in this element, there is no differentiation because you want all of the kids to be tuned into whatever the focus is. So they're all going to do the same introduction. There could be variances where you ask maybe certain students to sit closer. Do you ask certain students along the way, maybe you need to stop and ask them certain questions, but generally the whole introduction will be the same. And I've chosen to use Margaret Wild's Fox, and I am going to summarise as I go with my own annotations on sticky notes, giving the kids a worked example of what I expect them to do when they go off and work independently. Where there'll be the heaviest amount of differentiation is in the body of the lesson, because you're going to be able to show me academic abilities. So I should be able to see that you've catered for all of those different levels in your grade. Now, this is only a hypothetical lesson plan, so we don't know exactly who's going to be where. It's not we don't have any real assessment yet. So we're going to have to give them, say, an extended group, a lower group, and sort of a mid-range group. There might be cultural implications, particularly if you've got texts that have some issues or some concepts that maybe kids aren't familiar with or they haven't had any connection to. You could give them extra time and change the process. So let's have a look. So in the body, once I've done my introduction with my sticky notes and I've talked about summarising and I've gone over the learning intentions with the kids and I've moved to the middle of the lesson, I'm going to ask some kids, so this is probably my mid, if I'm pitching it to the middle of grade 2, that means that my high flying kids could potentially be from grade 3 to grade 4 level. So it could be handy for you to look at the Victorian curriculum content descriptors for above and see what is required of those particular students. So my mid-range students, I'm going to ask them to write a summary. So they're going to do their independent reading, but then they're going to have a reflection that they have to do, which is always good after some independent reading to keep them accountable, to make sure that they are reading and they are focused on what their learning intention is. On a sticky note, they will write some main points down for me in a summary. Whether you want them to do it on a sticky note or on a book, these are maybe changes to the process or changes to your lesson which could cater to different abilities. But I want them, the kids in my middle group, to write a reflection about their independent reading text. I'm assuming by grade 2 that this would be a task that they could do fairly independently. However, in order to provide that quality differentiation, with some students, I'm going to provide them some sort of scaffold or some sort of template so that when they go back to their table and sit down and think, oh, I need to write a summary, and then they think, oh, I can't do it, I don't know what to write, I've forgotten everything she said. They've got this planner or some sort of template. I'm not sure if I really like this one a lot. I'd probably spend a little bit of time maybe finding something better, but I'd want some sort of scaffold to be sent back to the table with them. What prompt can you give them? This works really well with writing too for kids that get stuck. What can you send them back to the table with that's going to help them to be able to complete the task independently? So the people in this group don't need a prompt. They're able to go back to the table and write that summary for me. These ones are going to use this prompt in front of them to remind them who was the main character. Ah, this is my acronym. Somebody wanted, but so then. There we go. The somebody was the mouse. He wanted to eat some cheese, but there was no cheese left, so he had to go to the shop, and then he was able to be full and he came home again. So students can use this prompt to help them to write the summary. So it's able to still, everybody is still working on summarizing. So the people here are doing it independently. These, you can offer it to the kids and say, who would like this prompt? Who would like this scaffold to take back to the table? Use that kind of language with them and get them used to asking for this kind of help. As well as that, if you've got students who are above, there might not be too many of them, but there will be some, you're going to need to extend them. Extending is just as important as providing these for the students who need extra help. So how can you extend them? We don't want to have them doing something totally different. I can't get my extension group and say, hey, you guys are going to learn inference. You're going to learn to infer, because the class are not learning to infer. If it was a lesson on inference, that would be fine, but we're learning to summarize. So I need to keep the focus the same. So in an attempt to extend that high group, I'm going to actually ask them to look at paraphrasing. Now, whether you wanted to do this in a guided group, that could be a good avenue so that you could get those kids together, sit down and talk about paraphrasing with them. I would give them a different text, a much more complex text, to ask them to summarize something for you and paraphrase something for you, and talk in that group about how it relates to summarizing, yet it's about constructing that passage in your own words. It goes beyond summarizing. So summarizing is just putting the main ideas and points into your own words, but paraphrasing is actually constructing those sentences and keeping the same ideas. I would probably get them to use perhaps a non-fiction text at first, but then we could move on to other things. So we're still keeping it with the theme of summarizing, and we could compare summarizing and paraphrasing, but it's just adding that extra level of complexity for those students who can do more. You'll have some students in that grade 2 grade who might read their text really quickly and summarize really quickly, and they would be able to do a lot more for you than that. So as I've said here, it's really important that the focus is on the differentiating tasks don't change, only the level of ability. So if you are writing a narrative and you are focusing on orientation, everyone needs to write you an orientation. Don't change the focus, but what can you change so that everyone can access the task and everyone can have success with the task? So I might decide to do a guided reading group with that top kids, or I might decide to let them go off and explore paraphrasing for me while I worked with some other groups. But flexible groupings is a great way to differentiate as well, and you can explain how perhaps whether you want it to be an ability group, whether you want it to be a mixed group so that students are peer learning and sort of mentoring with each other. But flexible groupings are really important. We also need to consider differentiation when we're thinking about assessment. And these are some questions that I've just come up with in terms of assessment. So when you're focusing on your lesson, you know, are any of these things possible? So perhaps a dyslexic student could do a verbal recall rather than a written submission. So you know that they understand the element of summarizing, but if we know that that poor student is going to take 40 minutes to write a couple of sentences down, and when really writing is not the focus, writing is just an avenue to visualize your thinking. So perhaps there's another way that that student can show that they understand the learning intentions, which was, can you summarize a text? Can a child with learning difficulties have more time to complete the assessment? And we're not talking about formal assessments, we're just talking about whatever information the kids are going to give you at the end of the lesson so that you know how to plan your next lesson. Do they need more time? Time is an element of differentiation. Or how can we give them more time? Can I read the assessment questions or criteria to some students? So do you need to bring students back over to you so that you can reiterate the learning intentions to them? Do you need to stop midway through the lesson and talk about some of these criteria again so that when you come to assess it at the end of the lesson, you've touched base with certain students? Think about the structure of your lesson and how you can think about how you're going to assess them so that it's equitable and fair and inclusive for everyone. Can I scribe for some students, which kind of relates back to that first one where students might need help getting their ideas down. Could it perhaps be a drawing? If I just want them to be able to summarize the main ideas, how else could they show me so that it's accessible to them? But they're still showing me that they understand the learning intentions, which is really important. So in your lesson plan, it's really important to think about that body of the lesson. Think about all of the things we've talked about here. How can you differentiate for different academic abilities, both higher and lower? How can you cater to kids who have particular learning needs? What can you give them? What prompts can you give them? What aids can you give them? Do they need visual aids? Do they need things written down for them? Do they need a template? Do they need question prompts? What can we give them that's going to make sure that they can access the learning intentions? Don't change your focus.